Today we're going to look at Matthew 7, verses 13 and 14, and we're going to make some observations pretty much following our same process that we've done so far. So let's begin. This text, enter through the narrow gate, for the gate is wide and the way is broad that leads to destruction, and there are many who enter through it. For the gate is small and the way is narrow that leads to life, and there are few who find it. So obviously, as we read this, we see there's a comparison going between the gate that is wide and the gate that is small. And as we begin to make these observations, we're going to begin to change out this text and kind of rearrange it diagrammatically, if you will, as well as doing our notes. So let's begin. Number one, things to note, underline all verbs. So first of all, we have the verb enter, which is actually an imperative verb, but we'll talk about that later. Enter through the narrow gate, for the gate is wide and the way is broad that leads is a verb, to destruction. There are many who enter through it. For the gate is small and the way is narrow that leads to life, and there are few who find it. So that's where we begin. Now let's go back and begin to add our conjunctions. Just a reminder of fanboys, for, and, nor, but, or, yet, so. And as we walk through this, we see that here's the word for. For the gate is wide and the way is broad. Actually, here's another one that leads to destruction. And there are many who enter through it. For the gate is small and the way is narrow that leads to life, and there are few who find it. Now, notice a few things here. First of all, this enter right here is an imperative verb. It's a command. It's telling them to do something. So enter through the narrow gate. And if you're thinking through this logically, you'd say, well, why? Why would I enter through the narrow gate? Well, he begins to answer it with this reason clause, for. So let's bump this down and we'll kind of separate it. And then if you'll notice, there's another one, another for clause here. So let's kick this down to give some separation. Enter through the narrow gate, for the gate is wide and the way is broad that leads to destruction. There are many who enter through it. And then enter through the narrow gate, for the gate is small and the way is narrow. So you'll see we're kind of structuring our passage here a little bit, making some observations. Now let's keep going. Repetition of words, highlight key theological or significant words. As we think through that, we begin to see the word gate over and over again. So let's just highlight that so it kind of stands out. So we have this key word here. The gate is wide, which is very different from what he says here. The gate is small. So let's just kind of compare those. Those are going to be contrasting, and we'll see that in a minute. But this narrow gate is probably what he's talking about here with the small. So let's maybe change this just to make it distinguish a little bit. So enter through the narrow gate, or the small gate, as opposed to this wide gate. There are some other words in here that are important. We'll just kind of highlight them, maybe with red. The way is broad that leads to destruction. And then there are many, there's a word, who enter through it. And then, of course, we go down here and we see the way is narrow. Let's go back and pick out that red, that leads to life as opposed to destruction. And there are few here who find it. If we look at the next in our things to note, we see contrast. There's obviously a contrast going on between the gate which is wide and the gate which is small. But let's continue to make some observations here. For the gate is wide, I'm just going to bump that down. And the gate that is broad leads to destruction. And there are there are many who enter through it. Well, notice the same thing is here. For the gate is small. If we kind of put that down here, and the way is narrow that leads to life, and there are few who find it. So if we just think about this, we see the obvious contrasts that are going on in our passage. So let's just note a few of them. We have the broad, which is contrasted with the narrow. And then we have the many who are contrasted with the few here. And finally, we see one results in destruction, one results in life. And so these are obvious contrasts. We don't see the word but we see there's obviously an opposite connotation here. And so that's important to denote as we go through. So let's look at any comparisons. There are no real comparisons here in so much that these are contrast, not compared. There's not really a list unless you say, well, here's the wide gate and here's the small gate. That might be worth noting, and that's fine. Is there a cause and effect? Well, there's a little bit of cause and effect here. If we think about the person who enters the wide gate, they're going to ultimately end up in destruction. So how do you end up in destruction? Well, if you go through the wide, sorry about that, the result is destruction. And also, if you enter through the small, ends up with life. And so we see two cause and effects. If we think about it here, we see, the cause as you go through this gate, and the effect or the result is destruction. We see the cause here. If you go through the small, narrow gate, the result or the effect is life. And then notice the number 8 on our list. We see the figures of speech. Are there any figures of speech here? Well, obviously there are. We have this whole idea of the gate. He's not talking about necessarily a real gate. He's talking about this idea of entering into heaven in the context of what Jesus is talking about here on the Sermon on the Mount. And so this gate is a figure for a door or a way in. So how do we get into heaven? Well, we're not going to really walk through a gate, but there is one way in. There's one passage. There's one access, and that's to the Lord Jesus Christ. And so we would denote this as somewhat of a figure of speech on our notes, and that would be great. And then finally, let's look at the last one, pronouns. So no real pronouns in here. Enter through the narrow gate, for the gate is wide, the way is broad that leads to destruction. There are many who enter through it, for the gate is small. There's no real statements there. So the last thing we need to do in our work today is to make some observation statements. And so I'm going to clean up some of this, and then let's go back here. Let's make some observations. Remember, part of our work is not just to doodle on the page, but also to make some clear statements about what we're seeing. And so this is the very important step. A lot of times students leave this off. They've made doodles on the page, but they never actually have done anything. So let's make some observations here. Number one, the verb enter is an imperative command. In other words, Jesus is telling the disciples what to do. It's not sit and look at the gate. It's not even to consider the beauty of the gate. They are to enter it. Another thing, we see a comparison is being made between a wide gate and a small gate. Now, we're only looking at really 2 verses here, but if we were looking at a longer passage, you might even go in and note where these are. So for now, the wide gate is in verse 13, and the small gate here is in verse 14. That again helps you 5 days from now when you're looking at a text to know exactly where your observations came from. And as you're getting ready to preach or teach this passage, these observations will be critical for you. So what's the comparison? Well, we see different things. We see the way, we see a broad versus a narrow. We see the result is one leads to destruction versus the other leads to life. The people, we see many find one versus few find the other. What else do we see? We are given 2 reasons to enter the narrow gate. You say, well, where do those come from? Well, if you look back at our text up here, we'll see, well, there's reason 1, enter for the gate is wide. If you want to end up in destruction, well, there you go. But there's a second reason, and so if we look down here at this other reason clause, 4, then we say, well, if you want to enter the narrow gate, then this is going to lead to life. And so we see at least this idea of 2 reasons. One reason is the wide gate results in death. I can't type. Results in destruction. The second reason is that the small gate leads to life. And you would continue to make as many observations as you can. Things like imperative tense, present tense, past tense, all the comparisons that you can. The other thing we want to do here is identify the figure of speech. So in our case, the term gate is a figurative term relating how one is to enter heaven. And so you might want to explain that a little bit. And again, just go through your observations, making as many of them as you possibly can. The goal really is to make 20 or 30 observations, even from these verses. Now, I've already listed 7, but we could go back and begin to think about what this means, that the way is broad and the way is narrow. Now, the problem that many students get into is that they begin to cross interpretation with observation. At this stage of the game, all you're doing is making observations of the passage. What do you see? Not what does it mean, but what do you see? What is being said on the page in its original context that the original historical audience would have understood? So this is a sample of doing observations using our things to note list, thinking through, doing a little bit of what we call structural diagram as we begin to break down the text into its respective parts. This is all very important. Hours spent in observation will lead to much more accurate interpretation.